Hello viewers, and welcome to the latest installment of the LOTR LCG Progression Series, a production by Cardboard of the Rings, the bi-weekly podcast about the Lord of the Rings the card game, which is a living card game by Fantasy Flight Games. My name is Mitch.
And I'm Matthew.
Today, we're going to be taking a look at the 9 new player cards and new hero card of the Drúadan Forest Adventure Pack. So Matthew, why don't you start us off?
The hero for this adventure pack is Mirlan. She has a threat cost of 8, 2 willpower, 2 attack strength, 1 defense strength, 3 hit points. She's a Sylvan, and her ability is each hero you control with a printed lore resource icon gets -1 threat cost. As we talked about in our Steward Sphere review video, one of the sub-themes of this particular cycle of adventure packs is monosphere decks, and Mirlan is certainly the first hero that we've seen that's really sort of pushing this sub-theme, in this case, of course, for lore. You know, straight away, I think the first thing I think about her is mediocre stats, not a whole lot of Sylvan synergy, but beyond that, if there's a plus to her, it's that lore doesn't have any. Well, it has one in-sphere threat reducing card, which would be the secrecy card, Needful to Know, which is kind of a bit of a gamble. So on the one hand, she does sort of address a weakness of the lore sphere, which again, of course, is threat reduction, but it's only -1. So if you're playing mono lore, at most you're only saving 3 threat, which over the course of an entire game, that could certainly mean life or death, I suppose. There's certainly tons of doomed cards or raise your threat cards or whatnot, and 3 could make or break some games. But I would think in the grand scheme of things that 3 is probably sort of insignificant and probably not worth including a hero that otherwise, at least to me, has relatively mediocre stats.
I think the primary problem with Mirlan here is she doesn't really have any sort of synergy to back her up. So the natural comparison in an extraordinarily low-threat hero is the spirit version of Glorfindel, where he's a savings of 7 threat. With Mirlan, you're really only reducing your threat by 3, and that's all she has going for her as an ability. Of course, Glorfindel does raise your threat by 1 each round, but you still have to quest 4 times without Light of Valinor attached to him before he breaks even with Mirlan. And of course, he's spirit and she's lore, but when I mentioned there's not a lot of cards to back her up, the existing Sylvan synergy is pretty much limited to either a defensive healing capacity or a combat capacity. The only cards that come to mind are the Sylvan Tracker, which is a pretty expensive means of slowly healing characters, so unless you're also taking advantage of someone like Elrond, that isn't necessarily doing you a lot of good. But apart from that, there's the Rivendell Blade and the Rivendell Bow, and neither of those are very mono-lore friendly, so maybe if you've got a tactics player to help you out, she can be pretty decent. Her stats are acceptable, her hit points really aren't anything special, and all of that kind of lends itself to being a pretty dangerous prospect to using her as your defender. So if it just so happens that players are taking advantage of Sylvan Tracker, especially if they have Elrond as one of their lore heroes in play, then maybe she could be an excellent recipient of some of that Drúadan Forest archery damage, but outside of that, she strikes me as a very underwhelming hero. So all in all, Mirlan makes for a hero that, without a lot of development of the Sylvan synergy, I just don't see myself playing anytime soon.
Right, I think I agree. I've seen her be used in my local playgroup. I don't think anyone walked away particularly fond of her after a few games, though we only played 1 or 2 quests. I think I'm going to have to echo what you said. Perhaps if we get Sylvan synergy, but even more importantly, if we get lore Sylvan synergy, because she's designed for mono lore decks, if the future Sylvan cards are spirit, leadership, or tactics, not doing her a whole lot of good unless you're in a multiplayer game, and then other players can play those cards on you, which then again makes me question why you would use this particular hero. We talked about this in our Steward Sphere video, knowing that we only get about 12 or so cards per sphere when we're 3 packs in at the recording of this particular video, I don't see a whole lot of cards yet that are making me shout, yes, I want to make a monosphere deck. This is going to make Mirlan shine. And even if I did want to make a monosphere lore deck in particular, is -3 threat, like I said a second ago, really worth it? There are probably 3 better lore heroes to use. I think that her ability, to me, is just secondary. If she had better stats, I wouldn't care if her threat cost was 10. If you bumped up her willpower or defense or even hit points by a point or 2, I think she might be more worth it. But, as she stands right now, I'm just not convinced that she's going to be a great addition to anyone's hero lineup. But certainly, who knows what will come down the pipe. So I'm going to have to give a wait and see, but sort of attitude. I don't want to dismiss her as just completely worthless, but probably not going to be making it into my decks anytime soon.
I think the operative word for Mirlan is unremarkable, but we might as well go ahead and pass on to our leadership cards, the first of which is Forlong, a unique ally with a cost of 3, 1 willpower, 1 attack, 1 defense, and 3 hit points. He's our first unique Outlands ally, and he reads, while you control Outlands allies that belong to 4 different spheres, ready Forlong at the beginning of each phase. What makes this character so special is that the Outlands deck is all about running all 4 different spheres of influence. So Hirluin the Fair allows you to play any Outlands characters with his resources, and as soon as you have one of each kind, Forlong can not only be committed to the quest, he can not only use actions during, let's say, travel or engagement, but he can also do something during combat. So Forlong not only benefits from that powerful Outlands synergy, but because that generally increases all statistics of a character, he can just fill a multitude of different roles.
Absolutely. I think when either the spoilers were posted for this pack online or I cracked open the pack, I think I, honest to God, rolled my eyes at this particular card. I was like, ugh, as if Outlands needed something so ridiculously powerful. We just went through our Steward Sphere playthrough. You played Outlands, which is the first time I've experienced Outlands, in air quotes here, in real life. And you had allies on the table from all spheres relatively quickly. So this guy is going to become a just beefy quester, attacker, and defender, and then perhaps for tricks like a very good tail or whatever else in various phases quite quickly, provided you have good card draw. Now, luckily he is a unique ally, so you can only have one of him in play across the table if it's a multiplayer game, and that certainly restricts him to some degree, but he's cheap. He only costs 3. He's got a nice beefy 3 hit points, which can get boosted quite a bit by some of the other Outlands characters. I don't have much to say other than ridiculously powerful. I don't even know why the Outlands needed a character such as this. Again, I don't want to hate on Outlands too much. It just does not appeal to me. It doesn't mean I don't recognize the power of the card, but it almost puts the dwarves to shame, and everyone's sick of those. So, yeah, if you're going to play an Outlands deck, I can't imagine not using Forlong.
I definitely have to agree that he is immensely powerful. It's very simple for an Outlands deck to get allies of those 4 different spheres in play. He can count as a leadership ally. Amphalos Herdsman is 1 cost. Knights of the Swan costs 1. Aether Swordsman is 2. So with that tiny little resource investment, not only are all of those characters enhancing one another, but he's readying each and every phase. What's remarkable in particular about him is that for 1 more resource cost than Warrior of Losernock, the Outlands ally that boosts up defense, he's got 3 hit points instead of 1. And since he doesn't actually bolster up the other Outlands allies, I'm relatively comfortable using him as a chump blocker if I know I have additional copies in my deck, so I can preserve my ever so valuable global enhancement Outlands characters and just sacrifice this guy. And once you've got a bunch of herdsmen or warriors in play, once he gets up to something like 4 defense and 6 hit points, he's just an absolute beast. You mentioned a very good tail. He costs 3, so exhausting him and any other character, Outlands gets even more ridiculous. Really, the only limitation to this guy is there aren't a ton of cards that take advantage of you exhausting allies. For example, there's Hail of Stones and Quick Strike, but neither of those are particularly well suited for the Outlands decks that I've played. But in any case, I think he's absolutely astounding, and comparing him to the hero of this adventure pack, he just absolutely blows me away.
Our final leadership card of this adventure pack is an event, Strength of Arms, with a cost of 2. And you can play this card only if each hero you control has a printed leadership icon. Action, ready each ally in play. So again, there's at least one card per sphere in this pack that's pushing this monosphere theme. This is the leadership's version. Certainly what comes to mind here is Grim Resolve with a cost of 5, also a leadership card that readies all characters in play from the core set, and then Lure of Moria, which costs 3, which readies all dwarf characters in play. And so this is a very similar card. This is part of leadership rallying the troops, only this time it's cheaper. It only costs 2, but it only readies allies, unlike Grim Resolve and Lure of Moria, which would ready heroes, potentially. So I think it's a fantastic card. It's very well costed. If you're going to be playing mono leadership, I see no reason to not include this card in your deck. You'll be able to quest and attack or quest and defend with a whole bunch of different characters, and I just think it's quite powerful with a reasonable cost.
I definitely think that out of all the cards that are supposed to push us in the direction of playing monosphere decks, this is probably one of the most powerful, if not the most powerful. In a multiplayer game, even though your heroes don't benefit, every single ally on the table, up to 4 players, is readied for a mere cost of 2 resources. And if you're playing leadership, especially if every one of your characters is leadership, that means you're going to have resources to spare. I like that unlike Lure of Moria, as you mentioned, there's no racial restriction to this one. And even though it doesn't ready your heroes, since the Gondor, Dwarf, and Outland synergy all benefit from flooding the table with allies, this makes for an extraordinarily powerful effect. So you can do a massive questing push, and then you can pull everyone back, and then do a ton of combat. We've recently seen a surge of players that are doing mono-leadership dwarf decks, using Dane, Thorin, and Balin, in addition to Narvi's Belt, to use dwarf allies of all 4 spheres of influence. So even though you've got all sorts of allies on the table, since all of your heroes have that printed leadership resource icon, you can still take advantage of this. And in our next adventure pack, we're going to be seeing something else that rewards players for playing all leadership heroes that lends itself perfectly to the Outlands deck. So I think this is a spectacularly powerful card, and it's only going to get better as we see more mono leadership stuff and more leadership heroes. So on to our tactics cards, the first of which is an attachment called Mighty Prowess. It has a cost of 1 and has the trait Skill. It reads, attached to a tactics hero, limit 1 per hero. And response is, after attached hero attacks and destroys an enemy, deal 1 damage to another enemy that shares a trait with the enemy just destroyed. So, needless to say, Tactics absolutely excels at destroying enemies, and if players are already taking advantage of a multitude of direct damage effects, even though 1 point might not seem like a lot, it can nevertheless make all the difference between the life and death of a character or having to stomach some sort of awful encounter effect.
I certainly think this is an interesting card. It's my favorite of the 2 tactics cards in this particular adventure pack. I have included it in decks, and I have gotten it played, but it was late in the game, and there wasn't a whole lot of attacking going on at that point. I think I agree with you, Mitch, in that it would be very nice in conjunction with direct damage such as Thalon, perhaps the Spear of the Citadel, or any other direct damage effect, in that if they're already sort of wounded, you can sort of strategically decide which enemies you're going to attack first. So if there's one of them that only needs 1 more damage to die, you attack the other guy first and then put that damage on the enemy with the same trait that only has 1 damage left due to getting damage from Thalon or a spear defense or whatever. So I like it, and I think, in most quests, and I didn't go back and analyze too many encounter decks, but it seems like in a lot of quests, certainly the more recent ones, the enemies are all of the same ilk. They're orcs, or they're men, or they are the wozes in this particular quest. So I think it's nice. I think it could work. Now, certainly in some of the earlier quests from the core set, or maybe even Mirkwood, the enemies seem to be a little bit more varied. So as we say so often in our card reviews, you want to do some encounter deck analysis before you just slap this into a deck. But, if multiple heroes have this attached to them and they're attacking, this could add up to some pretty lethal damage on characters. I do think it's worth stressing that this is when the attached hero attacks and destroys. So something like the Spear of the Citadel wouldn't qualify as an attack, or using Goblin Cleaver to place some direct damage wouldn't count as a hero attacking. So the hero actually has to exhaust to use his attack strength and then destroy the enemy for this to work. But provided you can meet that condition, I still think this is a pretty interesting and potentially valuable card.
For that exact reason, I think this works spectacularly well with something like Quick Strike. So you get in an attack before you deal with enemy attacks. Ideally, you kill that one enemy that's attacking you, and then you add that 1 point of damage to any enemy on the entire board, whether it's in the staging area, engaged with you or another player, and hopefully that enemy dies as well, or, as we've pointed out, you soften it up sufficiently for any number of defensive damage effects. It works great with Hands Upon the Bow, and if you're using Hama to recycle that, but it also works very well if you're playing a low-threat deck. So if it just so happens that you get great U-Bow functioning so that you can shoot enemies in the staging area, maybe after the course of a couple rounds, maybe even more, even a pretty hardy enemy you can soften up sufficiently with Mighty Prowess. I think the price is certainly right. It goes great on a ranged character, so you can really maximize your ability to take advantage of this. And for all of those reasons, if you're running a pretty tricky deck, I suppose there's nothing preventing players from doing something like a Song of Battle on Dune here, and then having him attack into the staging area. So this is definitely an interesting one, and I'm curious to see just how effective this is in practice. I suppose as a closing thought, I think that Mighty Prowess could function exceptionally well with any number of effects that effectively pin enemies to the staging area. Fresh Tracks comes immediately to mind, in that not only is it a source of direct damage, but it also forces an enemy to stay put in the staging area. So maybe if you have one enemy engaged with you, you can arrange that either that turn, or possibly the next turn, that dangerous enemy stuck in the staging area ends up taking enough damage through Mighty Prowess, and or a combination of other effects, to end up being killed. And additionally, I think this could work very well in a lore tactics deck, or if you're playing tactics and you have a lore player helping you, just because the attachment Ranger Spikes could again be so powerful in pinning one enemy to the staging area, and then at your leisure you could gradually assign that damage to the pinned down target. I think this also works reasonably well with Forest Snare for the same reason, and if you are running either of those traps, once they end up in your discard pile, I think that's a perfect opportunity to return those into play, through any number of card effects, like Erebor Hammersmith or even Second Breakfast.
Up next is the Tactics event, Trained for War, with a cost of 2. Play only if each hero you control has the printed Tactics resource icon. Action. Until the end of the phase, if the current quest has no keyword, it gains Battle. So here's the Tactics Monosphere card, and I'm not too keen on this particular card. I think in a multiplayer game, this could certainly mess up the plans of other players, especially if they're not playing Tactics. In that if you're playing, Tactics and Spirit, for example, or maybe even Lore, they're not going to be very strong in attack, yet their willpower will be quite respectable, and so you completely switch the dynamics, and you might not be able to quest for enough. In a solo game, I suppose this could potentially be worth it if you're Monosphere Tactics as a way to make some questing progress. But it costs 2, which is kind of expensive, and Tactics cards aren't exactly cheap, and you only get 3 copies in your deck, and you'd probably need this more than 3 times. Certainly there is some event recycling, Hama, of course. There's a card coming up in the next adventure pack that recycles tactics events as well, but I just don't see myself ever using this because I play largely multiplayer. I haven't played solo in quite a long time, and I think this would just mess with my buddies' decks, and we would end up questing for an insignificant, or at least insufficient, amount.
This definitely does address the community outcry from the very beginning of the game that has been saying tactics is impossible to play solo. It certainly did help when Heirs of Numenor came out and we started seeing these battle and siege keywords, but even built into those scenarios there are quest phases. I'm thinking of the second quest phase of Siege of Caer Andros, where you've got that traditional willpower questing. So even though in a lot of ways that should be the easy one, for a pure tactics deck, it quickly becomes impossible. And because tactics can bring such massive amounts of attack strength to bear, think of Gimli with Citadel plates, or a gigantic Erebor Battlemaster, or even just a reusable Vassal of the Windlord, since you don't have to discard it from play. This can be a good opportunity for players to make a gigantic quest push, just because I feel like it is a lot easier to get a massive amount of attack strength as opposed to willpower, really in any sphere outside of spirits. The cost of 2 is pretty steep. It's pretty much the cost of an ally, but it does leave 1 resource a turn open if you're using all 3 of your resources each and every turn. You don't have any form of acceleration, so maybe you can save up for something like Feint, but certainly if you're playing mono tactics, there's almost no way that you're going to be able to afford this and something like Thicket of Spears each and every turn if you're taking advantage of that Hama recycling. So this is fascinating in that it allows players a new way of approaching the game and winning scenarios, but I find it very unlikely that you'll be seeing this one in our progression series videos. But on to our spirit cards, the first of which is an ally, Sylvan Refugee, with a cost of 1, 2 willpower, 0 attack, 0 defense, 1 hit point. It is Sylvan and has Forced. After a character leaves play, discard Sylvan Refugee from play. So for 2 willpower, it has an almost unbeatable cost. We're used to our more powerful allies being a cost of 2 for 2 willpower, but the problem with this guy is, just as we mentioned before, all of the Sylvan synergy has to do with either attacking or regaining hit points, and when it's only got 1 hit point to begin with, and it's got this Forced ability that makes it extraordinarily squishy, this card strikes me as potentially very powerful, but definitely something that's scenario-specific.
Yeah, not a fan. I certainly agree that 1 cost or 2 willpower is great, but it is so easy for allies to leave play, whether it's a Knife in the Back and the Steward's Fear, whether it's Necromancer's Reach, which would frankly just kill this particular ally outright, but any sort of direct damage effect, dying from defending an attack. It's just, is a character that is so fragile worth having in your deck when you could just save the resource and play a 2-cost ally next turn for 2 willpower? I mean, potentially powerful in the early game, but I would assume in most, if not almost all games, there's at least 1 ally that leaves play, and I think the 1 resource could have been better spent somewhere else. There are, I think, better 1-cost allies in the game, though perhaps not in the spirit sphere. Yeah, I'm just not too impressed. I mean, I would like it a lot more if it didn't have the particular ability. If it was still 0 attack, 0 defense, 1 hit point, it'd still be really squishy and very, very likely to die because you're going to be committing him to the quest, probably. But I agree with you with the Sylvan synergy being next to nothing. Not a card that I think even, if I start making spirit decks for our progression series, this is one that I'm just going to look right on by.
What is very interesting about this guy is he's the very first 1-cost spirit ally, so unlike the Erebor Record Keeper, there's nothing preventing you from blocking with this character, so it does serve that purpose. I think there are certain scenarios where it's going to be fantastic, like in The Lonely Mountain. There's not really a lot of characters leaving play, so I think it might be fantastic in that because you can get this safely into play. But in a situation like the Battle for Lake Town, where you need a ton of affordable willpower, this would be a terrible choice, just because in our playthroughs, it seemed like every turn we were losing an ally, and occasionally we'd lose 2 or 3 allies in the same round, so there are certainly scenarios where this is going to be fantastic, but you definitely have to do that analysis beforehand.
Now, there are certainly, and we haven't talked about this in a while because there haven't been cards like this, but back in the Mirkwood cycle, there seemed to be a bit more cards that play on characters leaving play, whether it's the Horn of Gondor from the core set, Prince Imrahil, Valiant Sacrifice, cards of that nature. Certainly, this would be a card that might fit quite well in a deck that relies on allies leaving play, because this one will probably be leaving play all the time. But outside of a sort of deck that's dependent on those effects, again, not my favorite ally of all time.
Sure, and I mean, for some things, you don't really even benefit from that redundancy. So if you've got Prince Imrahil in play, if ally A leaves play and Imrahil's already readied, if you lose your Sylvan Refugee, unlike something like Horn of Gondor, you're not really drawing any additional benefit. And a further restriction of this card is that it kind of prohibits players from taking advantage of common and very powerful effects like Sneak Attack, To Me, Oh My Kinsfolk, and even Core Set Gandalf, just because any character that enters play with a time limit is really going to work against Sylvan Refugee. And if you just so happen to find yourself in a situation where you're playing pickup games, it's kind of a liability to include this in your deck just because you have no idea what kind of effects your allies are going to be running, let alone what kind of encounter deck you might be running up against.
Our final spirit card of the adventure pack is Against the Shadow, a 2-cost event. Play only if each hero you control has the printed spirit resource icon. Action: until the end of the phase, spirit characters use their willpower instead of defense. I like this one much better than I like the tactics version because you're not limited to the questing phase with this particular card. You could turn willpower into defense for a siege quest, certainly, but you can also turn the willpower into defense for the actual defense against enemies, making heroes like Eowyn with a defense of 4 on par with Baragond. So in the sense that it's a little bit more flexible, it can be used during the questing phase, a particular quest, if they're the siege keyword, or regular old enemy defenses, I think it's not too bad. And, you know, one of the things Spirit doesn't excel at is defense or attacking. So this is, just like most of these mono sphere cards are doing, is shoring up a weakness in each of the respective spheres.
So I think that this is a card that is extraordinary in concept, but in practice it falls a little bit flat. So I think the cost is relatively fair. Thinking in general terms, spirit characters do tend to have moderate to high willpower and pretty low defensive statistics, but taking a look at the actual allies we have available to draw from, that switch between willpower and defense isn't necessarily always very significant. With very few exceptions, the difference between a spirit character's defense and willpower statistic is almost always 1. For example, Rider of the Mark with 2 willpower and 1 defense. So you can swap that value, so for a cost of 2, you're getting a little bit of a benefit. So maybe if you're siege questing, you do a little bit better job. But I'm not necessarily convinced that if you have a lot of defending to do, this is going to make that much of a difference. Eowyn, as you mentioned, is the most dramatic example of a big change occurring, as is Glorfindel. So Eowyn, there's a shift of 3 plus her ability. For Glorfindel, there's that shift of 2. And Beaufort, the hero in the Redhorn Gate adventure pack, so long as you've got Dane Ironfoot in play, also experiences a shift of 2. But then you get to things like West Road Traveler and the Sylvan Refugee that we just covered, where they're 1 hit point characters that all of a sudden have 2 defense strength, so pretty much worthless in a defensive capacity, but reasonable for questing. Like so many other monosphere cards, this restricts you to printed spirit heroes, and for better or worse, this is yet another example of a card that influences all spirit characters in play. I really like the idea of this card, but at the moment, I'm just not convinced. I can't help but compare this to something like Light the Beacons, which is way more expensive at a cost of 5, but it simply adds 2 defense to every single character. So if you're trying to do siege questing, I think that Light the Beacons is above and beyond more powerful, and so long as you have one extremely powerful defensive character, then you really need not worry about defending. So again, I'll just close by saying I like the idea of this card, but I was just very surprised taking a look at a list of all the different allies that we have in just how little benefit you can derive from a card like this, at least in our current card pool. But next up are our lore cards, the first of which is an ally named Harbor Master with a cost of 3, 1 willpower, 2 attack, 0 defense, and 2 hit points. It is Noldor, and response. After a card effect adds any number of resources to the resource pool of a hero you control, Harbor Master gains +1 defense until the end of the round. So this is an interesting ally in that it's a fairly expensive cost. It's got moderate attack strength, not a lot of willpower, but its ability is focused on either siege questing or defending. But if you're using this character in a defensive capacity, it starts off with 0 defense and only has 2 hit points. If you're trying to do the mono lore thing, then the only card that you have to draw from to add resources to a character is Biffer. So whether it's you or another player subtracting resources from one hero and adding them to another, lore doesn't really have any other means of boosting up defense strength. And if you're relying on that, a defensive one with 2 hit points, especially for a cost of 3, really isn't anything to write home about. Of course, there are a host of cards in this game that either you, if you're playing 2 or more spheres, or another player can draw from to add additional resources to your characters. And I do like that this lasts until the end of the round, so if during the planning phase you just load up on resource generation effects, you can end up with a pretty reasonable character. So Wealth of Gondor and Steward of Gondor gaining strength, and Theodred are all spectacular means of temporarily boosting up that defense strength, but a lot of those cards you can't really recycle. I think Horn of Gondor is probably the best case scenario, but if you're losing a lot of characters where your Harbor Master has a ton of defense, you're probably not necessarily doing that great overall. Glowin is another character where he's got a very potent resource generation effect, so potentially Harbor Master could get pretty big, but by the time Glowin takes damage, unless your Harbor Master is already committed to the quest and Glowin takes damage during the quest phase, that really isn't doing anything. And if you're defending against Glowin, unless it's just a small enemy, then your Harbor Master isn't necessarily getting very beefy, and even then, is it going to be enough to overcome some sort of gigantic attacker? And definitely worth mentioning is that Caleb Grace has verified for us that Errand Rider, which moves one resource from one character to another, does not actually trigger this response. So Harbor Master to me is an interesting card, but it strikes me as unfortunately, ultimately, almost useless.
I think I agree by and large. I don't have much to say. I think there are easier and perhaps cheaper ways to boost defensive characters in this game. Denethor, of course, hero from the core set, starts with 3 defense. He's quite nice. The Dunedain cards could also boost up defense much more easily than this particular card. I think it's wholly underwhelming, at least at this point, and I don't see it getting much better, especially because so many of the cards that boost resources in a way that would affect this card are not lore cards. And you only boost it by 1 no matter how many resources are added. So Steward of Gondor, of course, adds 2 resources, but he's only gaining 1 defense. So yeah, I largely echo what you have to say, and I think there are simply easier ways to get a good defender in the game than using Harbor Master. And that leads us to our final lore card of this adventure pack. It's the 2-cost event, Advance Warning. Play only if each hero you control has a printed lore resource icon action. Until the end of the phase, enemies do not make engagement checks. I like this one as well. I think it's better than Trained for War in that this one is good because it affects all players in the game, whether it's 1, 2, 3, or 4. No one has to make engagement checks. Certainly you could optionally engage should you care to, but for a cost of only 2, really take some of the heat off the players if they just cannot deal with the amount of attacks and they each only want to pull down 1 optionally or something. So I quite like it. I think it's pretty good, and in some situations it could be stellar.
I definitely think this can be pretty useful. It makes me think of the leadership card Fresh Tracks, where for 1 less resource, you deal 1 damage to and pin 1 enemy down in the staging area. But this is a much more dramatic effect, you just don't end up dealing any damage. So if you get a lot more enemies coming off the encounter deck than you were expecting, so you don't have any characters ready to do combat, I think this could be fantastic. Or, if you're just playing a deck with far more questing ability than the enemies have threat, this could easily kind of hold them off until that final quest push. So maybe you end the game with a ton of enemies just sitting there, essentially doing nothing in the staging area. I totally agree that if some giant nastiness is coming up, this can be a good opportunity for players to kind of pick and choose who they want to optionally engage, since lore is maybe going for a low threat value deck construct with Mirlan. If it just so happens that your threat gets up there, this card can be a bit of a nice panic button, and just like we covered before, I think Great U-Bow or Dune here, of course controlled by other players, could take fantastic advantage of those enemies being trapped in the staging area. Certainly this is a very useful card. Really the only thing I don't like about it is it's a little passive for my tastes. But if I were to find myself playing mono lore, I would definitely consider including this one. So, last but not least, we have our only neutral card of this adventure pack, which is the White Tower Watchman, an ally with a cost of 3, 1 willpower, 0 attack, 2 defense, and 3 hit points. It has the Gondor trait, and if each hero you control belongs to the same sphere of influence, you may assign damage from undefended enemy attacks to White Tower Watchman instead of a hero you control. So this guy is strikingly similar to the unique dwarf ally Dory, except he's a poorer attacker, but a better defender.
I think this is an interesting card. This is another one that some of my playgroup has experimented with, and ended up sort of being yet another card that's better in theory than actual practice. I'm not sure we ever actually used his ability. He was often expensive, and there were just better or other things to play. I don't think it's a bad ally by any stretch. I think his stats are respectable, the 1 willpower, 2 defense, 3 hit points, even for the cost of 3, and you're not playing mono sphere. But again, by and large, in practice, I haven't used him, but I haven't seen him used to great effect, though I certainly think it's possible. So for me, this is a wait-and-see sort of card.
Something that I really like about the White Tower Watchman is that his ability in a lot of ways is dissimilar to Dory's, so he doesn't actually have to exhaust, whereas that lore ally, if you're planning on taking some sort of massive amount of damage or undefended attack, unless you're readying him, he pretty much just has to sit there doing nothing until you maybe have him tank that damage. And for that cost of 3, I really don't like putting something on the table that I may or may not use. I like the Watchman because he's got a pretty significant amount of defensive strength, so base 2 defense, he's got that Gondor synergy, so you can play effects like 4 Gondor in order to boost him up to 3. He's got a pretty reasonable pool of hit points, so even in an Heirs of Numenor and Beyond environment, I think it's very possible for him to tank 1 attack, possibly take some damage, and then you can go ahead and use that ability, so he's almost a double chump blocker. And when you look at it that way, under a lot of circumstances, it's kind of saving you 2 cards for the price of 1. And for a lot of decks, your chump blockers might cost 2 resources, so it might end up being a pretty decent savings in the long run. And of course, it's a fantastic contingency plan just in case things go terribly wrong. Really, the only thing I don't like about him is, as we've mentioned so many times before, I'm not quite convinced at this point to really play monosphere decks, and apart from defending and being a reasonable siege quester, he's doing next to nothing for traditional questing or attacking. But I think we've about said all there is to say about all of these new cards, so Matthew, any overall thoughts about all of the cards of the Drúadan Forest Adventure Pack?
Well, I feel like this is perhaps the most negative review that I've done of any adventure pack, or at least certainly in quite a while. And, from where I'm sitting, I think that's probably accurate. It's completely underwhelming. In fact, I think the cycle as a whole has been, at least these two particular adventure packs, but spoiler alert, I think the same thing of the next one, is just underwhelming. I think part of it could have been expectations. I think we were expecting Gondor synergy. We're 3 packs in and it's non-existent. And I think that's frustrated some players. If you have no interest in monosphere decks, like I said in our Steward Sphere review, or little to no interest in Outlands, there's been very little for your decks. In the first pack, which the Steward Sphere, I put a slight notch above, only because I really like the Gondorian Shield. In this particular pack, there's not a single card I see myself using with any regularity. Even though I do like Mighty Prowess to some degree, I don't think it's for every deck, because I think it really depends on the encounter deck. Now, some of the other Monosphere cards I think are interesting, but I'm really going to reserve judgment, I think, on all of the Monosphere cards as a whole until we get to our 6th adventure pack and we really have all of the tools for Monosphere at our disposal. So by and large, I think this is one of the weakest adventure packs as far as the player cards are concerned to date, in that there's not a single card that I see myself using regularly, like I said a moment ago. So yeah, completely underwhelmed with this particular pack. It would not be my recommendation for new players when they're looking, which pack should I pick up to help boost my core set, or the core set in the deluxe expansion I just got. In fact, it might very well be the very last adventure pack I would ever recommend picking up, unless you're just really wanting to play through the narrative in order.
I definitely have to agree with you where it seems like everything I had to say about almost all of these cards was for the most part pretty unfavorable, in that none of these, with the exception of our leadership cards, really lend themselves to not only my playstyle, but they don't really have a lot of card development at the moment to back them up. I think they're very cool conceptually, but it seems like so often in playing this game we find ourselves saying, we'll have to see what comes down the road. So the Sylvan synergy is the latest to kind of join the waiting list for development. So, like we've been waiting for Hobbit synergy for a long time, like we're waiting on Gondor synergy, some of it kind of makes me wonder if we're ever really going to see a lot of powerful synergy, or if we're just going to continue to see relatively disjointed cards kind of released here and there. So I suppose I always end up saying I'm curious to see what else happens. We still have half of our Against the Shadow cycle of adventure packs to see, and countless deluxe and saga expansions, and even more adventure packs down the line. But I think the community as a whole is really crying for some sort of alternative to dwarf decks, and now Outlands decks.
I think one of the difficulties with designing this particular game, as opposed to FFG's other LCGs, of which I played all of them except for Call of Cthulhu, is that in their other LCGs, the adventure packs, or whatever they're called for that particular series, you still get 60 cards, but you don't have to get encounter cards, right? So you don't always get cards for your particular deck. So in Star Wars, for example, if I like the light side, half the pack is the light side, half the pack is the dark side, but you still get more light side cards than we would even get of our 9 player cards in this particular, and plus the 1 hero in Lord of the Rings. So part of the disadvantage is, like I said last time, we really only get approximately 12 cards per cycle for any sphere, not counting the heroes. And that, if you think about it, isn't very many. This is only our 3rd cycle, so the spheres don't grow too much within a cycle. Now, granted, we've had, like you mentioned, Mitch, the sagas and whatever else that do boost the card pool quite a bit, but the sagas are much more limited because The Hobbit's about dwarves. Most of those cards were about dwarves. The first half of Fellowship of the Ring is about hobbits, like you were talking about. So all the heroes and most of the cards I'm wagering will be hobbit centric. And so if you're not interested in those sorts of things, or at least those kind of decks, the saga player cards might not appeal to you so much. So on the one hand, I think I agree with you completely. Part of the reason I think I'm trying to give a somewhat nuanced review of these cards is, unlike our earlier Progression Series reviews, is we knew what was coming. We had 2 or 3 cycles worth of playing the cards, knowing what was to come. Here, we are just as much in the dark as anyone else, so I know that all the cards get designed at once. They're designed as a pool, and then however FFG decides to break them up, they break them up into adventure packs. So it's in some sense harder to evaluate a set as we go, unlike other games like Magic the Gathering, where the entire set is released in at once. So here we're sort of getting glimpses of what the designers had in mind. However, again, I'll say I'm sort of underwhelmed. This has been my least favorite cycle to date, and we're 3 packs in. Very few cards of the pack are things I would even consider using in my decks. I'm hoping the last 3 can save my opinion of Against the Shadow. We'll have to see. So I will say that I'm definitely looking forward to our playthrough of the Drúadan Forest. I quite like this quest. It's different. It's interesting. I like fighting a new type of enemy. So I will say, again, spoiler alert, that the quest really makes it for me for this particular pack, whereas the player cards fall flat.
So, as always, if your opinions differ from ours, please feel free to leave a comment below. We always enjoy reading what you guys have to write. But if you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit that like button, subscribe to our channel if you have not done so already. Next up is going to be our actual playthrough of the Drúadan Forest scenario, so we'll see you again soon.